The European Union is at a significant crossroads, a pivotal moment in its history. The world is changing at an unprecedented pace. Old alliances that once seemed unbreakable are now fraying. New powers are rising, challenging the status quo. The EU needs to adapt, and it needs to do so quickly. The clock is ticking, and the stakes are higher than ever. The time for complacency is over. The urgency of the situation cannot be overstated. The future is being written right now, in real time, by the decisions we make today. For decades, the EU has enjoyed relative peace and prosperity, a beacon of stability in a turbulent world. It has been a major player on the world stage, influencing global policies and fostering international cooperation. But now, the ground is shifting beneath our feet. The geopolitical landscape is changing. The old rules no longer apply. The frameworks that once guided us are now obsolete. The EU can no longer rely on others to guarantee its security or advance its interests. It must take matters into its own hands. The EU faces a critical choice, a decision that will shape its future for generations to come. It can either cling to the past, hoping for the best and risk being left behind, or it can seize the moment, embrace change, and take bold steps forward. It can embrace its potential as a global power, a leader in innovation, diplomacy, and economic strength. The choice is clear. The EU must become stronger, more united, and more independent. Unity is our strength. It must forge its own path in a world of growing uncertainty, charting a course that ensures its future relevance and prosperity. The alternative is unthinkable. A slow decline into irrelevance, a future where the EU's influence wanes. A future where the EU is no longer in control of its own destiny, a shadow of its former self. That's a future none of us want to see. Together we can build a stronger, more resilient Europe. The world is no longer bipolar. The dynamics of global power have shifted dramatically. The United States is no longer the sole superpower. Its influence, while still significant, is now shared with other emerging powers. This has big implications for the EU. The European Union must navigate a more complex and multipolar world. It can no longer assume that its interests will always align with those of its traditional allies. The EU must be more strategic in its alliances. Take the United States, for example. Once a steadfast partner, its priorities are shifting. The US is increasingly focused on its own domestic challenges. Issues like economic inequality and political polarization are taking center stage. It is also looking to counter the rise of China. The US sees China as a strategic competitor on the global stage. This means that the EU can no longer take American support for granted. The transatlantic relationship is evolving, but it's not just the US. Other global players are also redefining their roles. The UK, a former EU member, is also charting its own course. Post-Brexit, the UK is seeking new alliances and trade deals. Brexit has left a scar on the European project. The departure of the UK has forced the EU to rethink its future. It has also made the EU more cautious about relying on close partners. Trust and cooperation are being reevaluated. The message is clear: the EU must be prepared to go it alone when necessary. Independence and self-reliance are becoming more critical. It cannot afford to be dependent on others. The EU needs to build its own capabilities and resilience. The days of free rides are over. Every nation must pull its weight. It's time for the EU to step up and take responsibility for its own future. The path ahead requires unity, strength, and vision. The world is becoming increasingly multipolar. New powers are emerging on the global stage. China, in particular, is challenging the existing order. This presents both challenges and opportunities for the EU. China's economic and military might is growing rapidly. It is becoming increasingly assertive in its foreign policy. This is putting pressure on the EU to rethink its relationship with Beijing. But China is not the only player. India, Brazil, and other emerging economies are also gaining influence. This is creating a more complex and fluid geopolitical landscape. The EU must learn to navigate this new reality. It needs to develop a more nuanced approach to foreign policy, one that recognizes the diversity of interests and perspectives in the world today. The EU faces not only external challenges but also internal ones. Brexit was a major blow to European unity. It exposed deep divisions within the bloc. It also emboldened Eurosceptic movements across the continent. The migrant crisis of 2015 further exacerbated these tensions. Member states struggled to agree on a common approach to asylum and immigration. This led to finger-pointing and recriminations. And let's not forget about the rise of nationalism. Across Europe, we see politicians exploiting people's fears and anxieties. They are peddling simplistic solutions to complex problems. This is undermining trust in democratic institutions. It is also making it harder to find common ground on critical issues. The EU cannot afford to be complacent about these internal challenges. If it wants to be a strong and effective actor on the world stage, it needs to get its own house in order. Section 5, Strategic Autonomy. Time for the EU to stand tall. The EU needs to develop strategic autonomy. This means being able to act independently in its own interests. It means having the political will and the military capacity to defend itself. Strategic autonomy does not mean isolationism. The EU should continue to cooperate with its allies, but it should not be afraid to chart its own course when necessary. This is especially important in areas like defense and security. The EU can no longer rely on the United States to be the guarantor of European security. It needs to be able to defend itself against a range of threats, from terrorism to cyber attacks to hybrid warfare. Strategic autonomy also means being less economically dependent on others. The EU needs to diversify its supply chains. It needs to reduce its reliance on critical raw materials from countries like China. Section 6. Defense matters. No more free rides. For too long, the EU has been content to free ride on American military power. This has to stop. The EU needs to invest in its own defense capabilities. This is not just about spending more money, it is about spending it smarter. The EU needs to develop a genuine common defense policy, one that goes beyond ad hoc cooperation, one that allows the EU to deploy troops and resources rapidly and effectively. This will require overcoming resistance from some member states, but it is essential if the EU wants to be taken seriously as a global power. Because let's be honest, you can't project power if you're constantly asking someone else to hold your beer. Investing in defense is not just about preparing for war, it is about preventing it. A strong and credible EU defense force will make potential adversaries think twice before challenging the bloc's interests. Section 7, Stronger Together, Unifying a Divided Europe. The European Union, a symbol of unity and cooperation, stands at a crossroads. The EU needs to strengthen its institutions and decision-making processes. This is not just a matter of internal efficiency, but a necessity for its survival and relevance in a rapidly changing world. This is essential if it wants to act decisively and effectively on the world stage. The global landscape is fraught with challenges that require a united and robust response. The current system is often slow and cumbersome. Bureaucratic red tape and lengthy deliberations hinder timely action. It is also prone to gridlock, especially on sensitive issues like foreign policy. Disagreements among member states can stall progress and weaken the EU's position. The EU needs to streamline its decision-making. Simplifying procedures and reducing unnecessary delays will enhance its ability to respond to crises. It needs to give its institutions more power to act. Empowering bodies like the European Commission and the European Parliament is crucial for decisive governance. This will require reforming the EU treaties. Updating these foundational documents will provide the legal framework needed for a more agile and responsive union. It will also require overcoming resistance from member states that are reluctant to cede sovereignty. National interests often clash with collective goals, creating friction, but the alternative is paralysis. Without reform, the EU risks becoming ineffective and irrelevant. The EU cannot afford to be bogged down in endless debates while the world burns around it. Global issues like climate change, security threats, and economic instability demand prompt action. It needs to be able to act swiftly and decisively to address the challenges of the 21st century. A nimble and united EU can better navigate the complexities of the modern world. Strengthening the EU also means promoting a shared European identity. This identity is built on the rich cultural diversity and common values that bind the continent together. This does not mean erasing national identities. Each member state brings its unique heritage and traditions to the collective European tapestry. It means fostering a sense of belonging to a common project. A project where every citizen feels they have a stake in the future of Europe. A project based on shared values of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. These principles are the bedrock of the European Union and the guiding light for its future. Section 8. Adapt or fade, the EU's defining moment. The EU is at a defining moment. The world is changing rapidly. Old certainties are crumbling. The EU can either adapt to this new reality or become increasingly irrelevant. The choice is clear. The EU must embrace strategic autonomy. It must invest in its own defense and security. It must strengthen its institutions and decision-making processes. And it must do all of this while upholding its core values of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. This is a daunting task, but it is not an impossible one. The EU has overcome many challenges in its history. It has shown that it is capable of great things when it acts together with purpose and determination. The time for complacency is over. The time for action is now. The future of the EU and indeed of Europe depends on it.